Well, hello everyone, happy Sunday. Welcome to my room. Today we're going to be addressing the topic whether someone, you or me or someone else, ought to doubt their type. And before I move on to this topic, just remember that you can follow me on Patreon, where you can get the opportunity to suggest videos for me to cover, and occasionally have and will release exclusive content there. Also my two books, my book on the INFJ, the Ecstatic Soul, available down below at the links, and my new novel, The Infinite Castle. Okay, so should you doubt your type? It's perhaps phrased as a provocative question, but as I hope I will be able to articulate in the course of this video, the reason why I'm asking this question is because this ties in with what I was discussing in yesterday's video in relation to the language of type. The idea that I was developing in the video yesterday is that type and typology are best appreciated as and most useful as a living language, which comes with its own vocabulary, its own concepts, its own way of helping us describe our experiences and make sense of them, cope with the world in the process. And that's, if type is to be, meaningful and useful at all, I think that's, from this first person perspective, I think that that's the approach to take. And from this perspective, I think that the idea of doubting your type is a really interesting one, because doubting one's type is, in the way in which I mean this, is really equivalent to the idea that you should not take your type for granted. And I think that, there's definitely different approaches here that I've been observing, among people. Like, you have people who identify as INFJ very strongly, and to the point where they probably would not be willing to doubt their type in any serious fashion. Sometimes they can get even a little bit defensive. If someone suggests that they might be of another type, accuse the person back, say they're projecting, or whatever the reason might be. I'd say that at least as far as I can see, it's more common to come across people who are set on having a certain type than to come across people who are happy to keep their type as an open possibility that constantly remains in question. And it's true that there are conflicting advantages and disadvantages and motives at stake behind these two possible attitudes. Because on the one hand, you could say, well, if type is a kind of narrative that helps me or you, describe my experiences, make sense of them, legitimize my experiences, make sense of the fact that they're not weird, even though some of the people might not have maybe the majority don't have that experience, don't come across in the world the way the majority does. Instead of feeling strange about it, I can sort of say, well, I have this vocabulary that helps me make sense of it, not feel shameful as a result, or feel like I'm a misfit or something like that. Okay, so that's very useful. And someone who is constantly keeping their type in doubt, or opening themselves up to the possibility of a different typing, you might say, well, they risk not deriving these benefits, because if they don't feel like they're affiliated with any particular type, then how will they be able to appropriate the vocabulary of a particular type to, again, cope with the world, So we really don't want to deprive ourselves of that particular semantic arsenal at our disposal. But at the same time, we don't want that semantic arsenal to become so rigid that it stops actually being useful in a lot of different situations. Like I said in my previous video, the world changes, our lives change, there's lots of new situations we've got to deal with, and it's possible that by having like a very strong identification with a particular type, which presupposes a very strong identification with a number of traits that a type is supposed to have, the situations in the future might present us with cases where, well, the resources that we've so fixedly identified with just don't give us what we need to make sense of the situation. And so in such a case, our type would actually not turn out to be something useful. In fact, it sometimes can be a hindrance. I'll give you an example to try to illustrate what I mean. So there's this concept of bad faith, that Sartre was the first to kind of, at least to formalize the idea that human beings, sometimes we essentialize ourselves into entities that are supposed to have a limited number of traits, fixed traits, in such a way that we can always fall back on that as a justification for not doing something that we in fact know we need to do. So we're not being true to ourselves by subscribing to a view of ourselves that is too limiting, but we often do that for psychological comfort, even though it's actually not productive or conducive to psychological growth. So the example that Sartre likes to use, or it's a well-known example from Sartre's book, is the example of the waiter. Someone's a waiter, and there's a part of him that would maybe like to do something else. Say maybe he wants to, I don't know, be a teacher. Okay. So there's a part of him that really wants to be a teacher, but it's hard because he knows that he's going to have to do X, Y, and Z, go back to studying, maybe, while working to be able to pay for bills. Maybe if he's also looking for a relationship, he thinks that there'll be pressure on him to kind of be full-time working so he can be financially independent, and he's afraid of not having enough time to do all these things. But these things are possible to do, but he will fall back on saying, actually, I'm a waiter. That's really kind of what defines me. I'm good at this job, and I'm not going to take risks. Maybe I'm be a terrible teacher. Maybe I won't even succeed in my studies. Maybe I'm not made for studying. So I'm just a waiter. And you can really rationalize not doing something that you need to do in this way to legitimize your absence of the decision that you need to make. And I think that this idea is related to to the risks around a rigid relationship to having a type, to never being open to doubting your type, because this bad faith or this essentialization is all the more likely to happen, with the consequence that you will struggle to be adapted to reality as it changes and as it evolves. So again, you start going on a few dates with someone, you really like them, and you actually, as part of you knows you want to try something with them. Maybe they have a strong personality, and they take you out of your comfort zone a certain way, and maybe they want to do kind of outdoor stuff more than you would like, and maybe like you have this kind of situation where you don't want to leave your comfort zone, and it doesn't work out, and it does, and it makes you sad, and you'll justify it by saying, I'm an INFJ, or I'm an ISTP, I'm an introvert, I'm not supposed to do all these outdoorsy things, and she is, and that type, or he is that type. We can do these things. We can do this with work. I'm not going to try to go for that particular job. It's the unknown. It seems to imply that I'm going to have to go out and network, and there's going to be the element of social interaction. I'm an INFP, I'm an introvert. And I'm an N-type, like if I go and talk to people, maybe there'll be censors and I won't know what to do. I won't be in my element. That's what happens when you're in bad faith, again. And when one of the legitimization tools you can use is in this case, your type. You limit yourself to a rigid definition of your type. By having a more flexible approach to your type, well, you risk a lot less to fall into these modes. Because you can think, well, maybe I think that I don't want to do any outdoorsy stuff or not a lot of it. But what if, doing so would not make me, would not automatically disqualify my type. Maybe I still am an INFJ. Or maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm really an ENFJ. Or something else. And so what? I'm open to it. I'll compare the different vocabularies and just see whichever suits me, not in my attempt to withdraw from reality in order to find a limiting comfort zone, but in my attempt to assert myself in the world in some way, because we all want that, and be happy and flourish. Flourishing, unfortunately, does demand, at least in part, getting out of your comfort zone, and rigid association to type can end up being a slightly smothering comfort zone. That's not to say that one should not think in terms of type, because again, it's tremendously useful, and we all have identifications as certain, belonging to a certain category or group. People who reject the theory of type still have dozens or hundreds of such identifications. Type is another one of them that can be very useful for a certain type of people, certain types of people. And that's great, but I think that being open to the possibility that you're not the type that you are, first of all, if you manage that, I think a lot of the time reveals that you are probably very confident in your type, paradoxically. Because when someone is very confident in their type, very comfortable in their type identification, they don't mind being open to the possibility they're another type. And I think that's probably where I am myself at this point, hopefully. And if so, I hope I remain in that kind of mode. People who tend to be very protective of their type and rigidly associating with their type reminds me a little bit like new converts in religion that are more radical than the most radical in some sense. It's like they have to prove themselves something because they're fundamentally unsure at that early stage whether they're going to remain in that religion. I think with type, there's just slightly analogous process going on where, a person who's actually at an unconscious level, not sure if they really are that type, by the process that Jungian describes as unconscious compensation, they'll tend to be all the more vociferous and ferocious in defending their type identification as quite rigid. So number one, it actually, if you manage to get to that stage, it probably actually reveals indirectly that you're very comfortable with your type. But I think the other very important perk is that you're also then open to the possibility that either you're another type or that you really are the type you think you are, but what that type represents, the list of the properties that type comes with is an open list. And that, between ENFJ and INFJ, or between INFJ and ISFJ, there's maybe more overlap than we'd like to admit to ourselves. And that we live in that overlap, more so toward INFJ maybe, but there's a lot of overlap. And that overlap allows us to also understand and make sense of the fact that in certain situations, we can deal with those situations a lot better than we think. If we think that, no, it's really a situation that an ISFJ would deal with better, or an ENFJ, it's not really for me. Well, maybe it's in the overlap and you underestimate the flexibility of the INFJ type or another type. But that does require that flexibility, which I think inevitably comes with being flexible also in your type identification. Doesn't mean abandoning it at all. As you can see, I think the opposite ultimately. But flexibility is key, because at the end of the day, again, the key to being happy and to flourishing is not to use your type as a justification for an inability to change and adapt to circumstances. That provides some short-term comfort, but not long-term contentment. But let me know what you think in the comments, guys. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. the rest of your weekend. Don't forget my Patreon, and I will catch you next weekend. See you guys. Take care.